Έχουμε μαζί μας σήμερα, και η χαρά μας είναι μεγάλη, τον Άντριου Κάνια, συγγραφέα του βιβλίου «Φιλοσοφία της δυτικής μουσικής», μια σύγχρονη εισαγωγή. Η μετάφραση του βιβλίου είναι του Γιάννη Βογιατζή και η επιστημονική επιμέλεια είναι του Στασινού Σταυριανέα. Ο Σταυριανέας είναι καθηγητής φιλοσοφίας στο Ανοιχτό Πανεπιστήμιο. Τη χαρά αυτή την οφείλουμε στο Φεστιβάλ Βιβλίου Χανίων, το οποίο από την πρώτη χρονιά που έγινε, φέτος είναι η 5η χρονιά, από την πρώτη χρονιά που έγινε, φάνηκε ότι έγινε για να μείνει. Και όντως έγινε ένας θεσμός πια, που είναι υπό την αιγίδα πλέον της Βουλής των Ελλήνων και του Υπουργείου Πολιτισμού, και συνδιοργανωτές έχει τον Δήμο Τίνου και την Περιφέρεια Κρήτης. Δήμο Χανίων, είδες, κάνει συνήθεια Βασίλη. Λοιπόν, ο Άντριου Κάνια είναι καθηγητής φιλοσοφίας στο Trinity University, στο Σαν Αντόνιο του Τέξας. Και η εξειδίκευσή του είναι στην αισθητική και τη φιλοσοφία της μουσικής, του κινηματογράφου και της λογοτεχνίας. Έκανε τις προπτυχιακές του σπουδές στο Όκλαντ και τις μεταπτυχιακές εκεί. Το διδακτορικό του το τελείωσε στο Μέριλαντ. Θα σας πω κάποια... Το έργο του βέβαια είναι μεγάλο, δεν είναι αυτό το βιβλίο που παρουσιάζουμε σήμερα, δεν είναι η μοναδική δουλειά. Έχει έναν τόμο, έναν και εξαιρετικός μάλιστα τόμος, στο The Outlets Companion of Philosophy and Music, που περιλαμβάνει μελέτες για κάθε όψη της μουσικής δημιουργίας και της τέχνης. Επίσης, έναν άλλον τόμο συλλογικό, για το κινηματογραφικό έργο του Christopher Nolan, «Momento». Έχει γράψει πάρα πολλά άρθρα σε περιοδικά φιλοσοφίας της τέχνης που αφορούν την οντολογία της jazz, της rock, της κλασικής μουσικής. Πριν αρχίσω την παρουσίαση του βιβλίου, θα ήθελα να σας διαβάσω από τον πρόλογο που έχει γράψει ο Άντριου Κάνια για την ελληνική έκδοση του βιβλίου του. Τον ευχαριστούμε γι' αυτό. Μια από τις θεμελιώδεις προκλήσεις που αντιμετωπίζω όταν προσπαθώ να εισαγάγω Αμερικανούς προπτυχιακούς φοιτητές και φοιτήτριες στη φιλοσοφία της μουσικής όλα αυτά τα χρόνια, είναι το γεγονός πως όταν σκέφτονται μουσική, σκέφτονται πρωτίστως τραγούδια. Πολλοί αγγλόφωνοι μάλιστα λένε τραγούδι και εννοούν κομμάτι μουσικής. Ο κύριος λόγος γι' αυτό δεν προκαλεί έκπληξη. Το μεγαλύτερο μέρος της μουσικής που ακούν οι άνθρωποι, ανά την ιστορία και ανά την υφήλιο, αποτελείται από τραγούδια, δηλαδή μουσική με στίχους. Γιατί όμως να αποτελεί πρόκληση κάτι τέτοιο? Διότι μεγάλο μέρος της βιβλιογραφίας στην αναλυτική φιλοσοφία της μουσικής, κυρίως η βιβλιογραφία περί συναισθηματικής εκφραστικότητας, περί κατανόησης της μουσικής και περί της αξίας της, έχει ως αντικείμενο την καθαρή οργανική μουσική και συγκεκριμένα τη μουσική της δυτικής κλασικής παράδοσης. Και οι περισσότεροι Αμερικανοί φοιτητές και φοιτήτριες δεν είναι εξοικειωμένοι με αυτή τη μουσική και με αυτή την παράδοση. Αυτή την πρόκληση είχα κατά νου όταν σχεδίαζα τη συγγραφή αυτού του βιβλίου. Η απάντησή μου ήταν να αρχίσω το βιβλίο με ένα κεφάλαιο για το τραγούδι. Αφετηρία είναι η απορία που προκάλεσε σε πολλούς η απονομή του βραβείου Νόμπελ Λογοτεχνίας στον Bob Dylan το 2016. Ακόμα και πολλοί λάτρεις του Dylan θεώρησαν ότι ήταν παράξενο να απονεμηθεί ένα λογοτεχνικό βραβείο σε κάποιον για τα τραγούδια του. Πράγματι, η συγκεκριμένη υπόθεση εγείρει θεμελιώδη ερωτήματα σχετικά με τη φύση των καλλιτεχνικών μέσων, καθώς και σχετικά με την κατανόηση και την αξία της τέχνης. Ένα πρόβλημα της στρατηγικής που δεν προέβλεψα ήταν ότι ένας διόλου καταφρόνητος αριθμός προπτυχιακών φοιτητών στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες δεν είχε ιδέα ότι ήταν ο Μπομπ Ντίλαν. Και τώρα λίγα λόγια για το βιβλίο, για τη δομή του βιβλίου. Το κάθε κεφάλαιο είναι αυτόνομο. Με το κεφάλαιο 1 που ασχολείται με το τραγούδι, τα επόμενα 8 κεφάλαια χωρίζονται σε 2 κυρία μέρη. Τα κεφάλαια από 2 έως 5 ασχολούνται με το πυρήνα της αναλυτικής φιλοσοφίας της μουσικής. Έτσι δεν είναι? Την προσπάθεια να συλληφθεί η αξία της μουσικής, καθώς και τα μεταφυσικά και επιστημολογικά ζητήματα που θέτουν οι πιο δημοφιλείς θεωρίες της αξίας αυτής. Τα δε κεφάλαια 2 και 3, στα κεφάλαια 2 και 3 λοιπόν, εξετάζεται η εκφραστικότητα της μουσικής και οι συναισθηματικές αντιδράσεις των ακροατών στη μουσική, αντίστοιχα. Στο κεφάλαιο 4 αναλύεται η φύση και η κατανόηση των μη συναισθηματικών μουσικών χαρακτήρων, όπως είναι το τονικό ύφος, ο ρυθμός, η φόρμα, η αρμονία. Στο κεφάλαιο 5 επικεντρώνεται στα ζητήματα όπως οι ποικίλες αυτές πτυχές της μουσικής, για το πώς οι ποικίλες αυτές μορφές της μουσικής εξηγούν την αξία της. Στα κεφάλαια 6, από 6 μάλλον ως 9, ο Κάνια στρέφεται από το μέσο της μουσικής σε διάφορα είδη δημιουργίας. Το κεφάλαιο 6 ασχολείται με την φύση της μουσικής εκτέλεσης γενικά και της εκτέλεσης μουσικών έργων πιο συγκεκριμένα. Το κεφάλαιο 7 εξετάζει την εκτέλεση έργων, εστιάζοντας στη διαμάχη περί της αυθεντικής εκτέλεσης κλασικών έργων, συζητώντας επίσης το ζήτημα της αυθεντικότητας της δημοφιλούς μουσικής. Και όταν λέει δημοφιλή μουσική, εννοεί την pop, jazz, hip-hop, heavy metal, rock. Το κεφάλαιο 8 συζητά τον αυτοσχεδιασμό, με επίκεντρο τη jazz, ενώ το κεφάλαιο 9 στρέφεται στις ηχογραφήσεις, εξετάζοντας τον τρόπο με τον οποίο αυτές επηρεάζουν τις θεωρίες περί κλασικής μουσικής και jazz, πριν προχωρήσει στις θεωρίες περί δημοφιλούς μουσικής που βασίζονται στις ηχογραφήσεις. Το κεφάλαιο 10 είναι αφιερωμένο στη σχέση μουσικής και ηθικότητας. Αν είναι επιλήψιμο από ηθική άποψη να σιγοτραγουδά κανείς ένα τραγούδι ηθικά επιλήψιμο, έπειτα αν η οργανική, η κλασική μουσική, και αν αυτό είναι ένα θέμα ενδιαφέρον, η κλασική μουσική, συμβάλλει στην καταπίεση των γυναικών, μια θέση που έχει υποστηριχθεί πολύ τελευταία στην πρόσφατη βιβλιογραφία. Αυτό θα ήθελα να μας εξηγήσει λιγάκι ο Κάνιου μετά. Και επίσης, αν είναι ηθικά αποδεκτό, λευκή μουσική να παίζουν μουσική των μαύρων, της μαύρης κουλτούρας μάλλον. Και το τελευταίο κεφάλαιο είναι στον ορισμό της μουσικής. Σας έδωσα μια ιδέα της δομής του βιβλίου και θα παρακαλέσω τον Άντριου να συνεχίσει και μετά θα ήθελα να του θέσω για κάποιες ερωτήσεις. Ευχαριστώ, Άντριου. Σε σένα το λόγο.
Thank you, Christina. Before I say anything philosophical, I'd like to begin by thanking a number of people without whose work I would not be here. One is, of course, the translator of the book, Yannis Vogiatis. I'm sorry he can't be here tonight. He was able to join us at a different event in Athens. And of course, I would like to thank Christina Zisi and everyone at Ekremes Editions for producing such a beautiful translation of the book. I think in many of its physical qualities, the Greek translation is a much more beautiful and impressive book than the original English publication. Though I'm in no position to judge the quality of the translation, of course. I would also like to thank everyone involved in the organization of the Khania Book Festival, for enabling me to be here. I think at rather late notice, managing to find a place for me in the program. I very much appreciate it, and I'm very pleased to be here in this beautiful venue and in this 5th iteration of what seems to be a really wonderful growing institution in Kania, in Crete, and in Greece more generally. And finally, I would like to thank Stasinos Stavrinea, who was really the person who got this whole project going of the translation of the book into Greek. So he was also unable to come here tonight, but I was fortunate to meet him in Athens, and I wanted to thank him also. As Christina has said, the book covers many, many different topics in the philosophy of music, and I thought it was better to perhaps just focus on one tonight, and I thought I would pick up where the book ends, as Christina explained, with the last chapter, which is really on the nature of music. What some philosophers would talk about as the definition of music, although I do not in fact defend a particular specific definition of music in the book. But I consider a bunch of different issues that thinking about the nature of music raises, and so I thought I would just touch on a few of those tonight. My starting point in this chapter, and where I will start tonight, is that, at least in English-speaking philosophy, a lot of philosophers have started to think about the nature of music with this phrase that's become almost a cliche. The phrase is that music is the art of sound. And I think that although this is a good place to start, it's actually potentially very misleading because almost every word in that phrase, I think, is problematic. So to start off with, it seems obvious, as most philosophers have acknowledged, that music is not the art of sound, if we take that to mean the only art of sound. Most obviously, oral poetry, recitations of poetry, are artistic. They're also sound, but they're clearly not music. Gerald Levinson, another philosopher of music, deals with this, what he calls the poetry problem, by essentially excluding language from the definition of music. He says that music, among other things, must be sounds intended to be appreciated primarily or in significant measure as sounds, rather than as symbols of discursive thought. So he essentially thinks that among artistic sounds, there's music and there's language, and that exhausts the field. Andy Hamilton, another philosopher of music, has argued that that's not going to be sufficient because, especially in the 20th century, there's been growing interest in what's variously called in English sound art or noise art. And the idea is this is artistic sounds that are very intentionally trying to find a kind of different space that's neither linguistic nor musical, but is sonic and is art. If we accept those arguments that there's this form of sonic art that is neither literature nor music, then it seems that if we wanted to find musical sounds, we're going to have to do it in terms of some sort of essential or at least central features that are essentially musical. Perhaps the most obvious place to start is with the notion of pitch, but the concept has to be handled very carefully. Pitch, as I understand it as a musical feature, is quite different from the purely physical objective feature of frequency. So all sounds have a frequency, but only some of those sounds will be perceived as pitched. For instance, if you think of a percussion solo involving instruments such as bongos, snare drums, cymbals, all of those sounds will have frequencies that can be measured physically, but they're not perceived to be pitched by people who understand music. So I think that pitch is essentially response dependent. To understand the notion of pitch as a musical feature, we have to take human psychology into account. It's a particular way we happen to have of understanding certain kinds of sounds. And essentially, in a nutshell, the idea is something like pitch is, for a sound to be pitched, is for it to occupy a discrete step in a division of the octave, or to put it more colloquially, a pitch is a member of a scale, a musical scale. Another obvious candidate for basic musical features that we might use to define music is meter, or rhythm perhaps, where this is understood similarly to be not a purely objective physical feature of the sounds, but rather a way in which we understand and organize the sonic stream, this time in terms of temporal groupings. However, even if we agree that there are basic musical features like pitch and meter, it's very difficult to see how we're going to form those in any simple way into a definition of music, because there seems to be clear cases of music with pitch but no rhythm, such as a kind of slowly, continuously changing series of chords. But there's also lots of music with rhythm but no pitch. For instance, a percussion solo or even a percussion ensemble with certain percussion instruments. But then we also can't say that music is any sounds that has pitch or rhythm, because there are lots of examples of artistic and non-artistic sounds that are rhythmic, but that we wouldn't want to call music. We can return to poetry, for instance, which is often talked about as having a meter and a rhythm. We might also think about dance. We can also think about all sorts of non-artistic human activities where people coordinate their activities by being metrical or rhythmical. So I'm going to leave that question of how exactly to incorporate these essentially musical features into a definition or a theory of what music is, and move on to a slightly different topic, which is perhaps more controversial in that I argue that music is not even an art of sound. That is, I don't think music is essentially artistic. Consider certain doorbells. Ding dong. It seems to me that a doorbell like that has musical features. It has pitches, it has perhaps a rhythm in a sense, and yet we wouldn't want to call it art. And I think what's misled a lot of people, at least in the English-speaking world and perhaps in other modern European languages, is that we only have one word for music. Whereas if we think about language and literature, in English and in many other European languages, we have two separate words. We understand language to be a kind of medium. It can be put to artistic ends, and then in English we call it literature, but can also be used for all sorts of other purposes. I think we need to make a similar distinction between music as a medium, more like language, and music as an art, more like literature. And I actually think the concept that's more interesting for philosophical inquiries into music is the concept of music as a medium rather than as an art. Of course, it's an interesting question what makes a use of the medium of music into art, but it seems to me that's a question about the nature of art more generally. I imagine that the answer to that question is going to be similar to what makes a use of language artistic, what makes a use of language literature. What makes music music, I think, is a question about the medium of music rather than about any artistic uses to which it's put. Once we start thinking of music as a medium or an art of sound, it's easy to forget the important role that silence plays in most music. But I think you can all supply your own examples. Some famous examples from the classical canon are the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, or the climax of Barber's Adagio for strings. These have crucial silences, and the way in which the silence is articulated, how long it is, and the quality of the silence, is just as important as the quality and the length of the notes that surround the silence. So, of course, conductors spend a lot of time thinking about how long they're going to take between the two opening motifs of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. But if music is a medium of sounds and silences, then the question arises whether there can be music that is purely silent. when this topic comes up, most people think of John Cage's notorious 4 minutes, 33 seconds from 1952. But in fact, I agree with most philosophers of music and musicologists that Cage's piece is not in fact silent. Cage intended the performer's silence to draw listeners' attentions to the ambient sounds in the environment. And those sounds, I would argue, along with many other people, are the content of that performance. Cage, of course, well, of course, if you're familiar with Cage's work, you'll know that Cage did not want you to hear those sounds or listen to those sounds for musical features, such as pitch or rhythm. He wanted you to hear them as sort of the pure sounds they are, in some sense. So I think Cage's work is more a piece of what I would call sound art or sonic art, neither music nor, of course, literature, a sonic art nonetheless. However, there are other candidates for the status of silent music. There's a much less well-known piece from over 3 decades earlier, a piece by Erwin Schulhoff called In Futurum. It's the middle movement in a suite of 5 sort of dances for piano. But while the other 4 dances have notes and rhythms and everything, they sound like music. The middle movement, In Futurum, consists entirely of rests. It's notated in a very strange way. It's worth searching out if you're interested. You might think it would be very simple to notate a silent piece, right? You just leave a blank. But in fact, he's painstakingly notated lots of rests of different lengths to make up this entire page of score that the pianist is supposed to sit there and perform by not playing any notes. So I think if silent music is possible, Schulhoff's In Futurum is perhaps the best candidate for the first piece of silent music. However, is silent music possible? Can there be music that is purely silent? I think a good case can be made for that by thinking about exactly what I started off with when talking about silence, namely that in what we might call ordinary, traditional music, the silences are not just gaps in the music, but are part of the music to be listened to, and they're parts of the music that musicians take care with. And it seems that, well, if we're supposed to pay attention to these silences, each one is important, why couldn't we have a piece of music that consists entirely of silence? On the other hand, Gerald Levinson, the philosopher I mentioned earlier, once said to me that even if holes are essential to a Swiss cheese, you can't have a Swiss cheese that's made entirely of holes. So if music's like Swiss cheese in that regard, then you can't have an entirely silent piece of music. So at the moment, I'll just leave this question open too. I feel myself torn between these 2 different kinds of arguments for and against the possibility of silent music. But I hope that in the short time available tonight, I've at least made a bit of a case that music is not perhaps the art of sound, but it is one medium of sounds and silence that can be put to artistic use. Thank you. Yep, turn it on. Yes.
Τώρα, όλοι συνδέουμε τη μουσική με κάποια συναισθηματική εμπειρία. Κάποια ιδιαίτερη δική μας, ίσως και ανεπανάληπτη εμπειρία. Εκτός όμως από το ιδιαίτερα ατομικά συναισθήματα που ο καθένας μας συνδέει με τούτο ή με εκείνο το έργο, αρκετοί φιλόσοφοι φαίνεται να πιστεύουν ότι η έκφραση συναισθημάτων από τη μουσική και η συναισθηματική εμπειρία αντίστοιχα είναι αναπόσπαστο και αντικειμενικό μέρος της λειτουργίας της μουσικής ως τέχνης. Άλλοι πάλι δίνουν λιγότερη βαρύτητα σε αυτή την πλευρά, θεωρώντας ότι τα συναισθήματα είναι κάτι υποκειμενικό και ανεξάρτητο από τις αντικειμενικές ιδιότητες της μουσικής. Πού στέκεσαι σε αυτή τη θέση, ποια είναι η δική σου θέση?
Thanks. It's an excellent question and a very large one. I would say the main focus of analytic philosophy of music from maybe 1980 to 2000 and beyond has been questions about emotions and music. And the interest, as you say, has been that a lot of philosophers have located the value of music in its emotional aspects, or rather, I should say, in two different ways in which it's related to emotion. The emotional experience of the listener listening to the music, but also the emotional expressivity of the music itself. In a way, I think a lot of that literature was working towards narrowing down what the interesting philosophical questions were, because of course we respond emotionally to music because we're emotional beings. We respond emotionally to everything. The philosophically interesting questions, I think, are how it could be that we respond emotionally to music's own expression of emotion. And the puzzle there is something like, you know, in some sense, music is just sounds and silences. So how can it be emotional? How is there anything there for us to respond emotionally to? And so a lot of the philosophical work done in the past 50 years or so has been on how music can possibly express emotions. It's been a remarkably controversial topic. And perhaps all I'll say about that is one might immediately think that, well, of course, music can be emotional because musicians express their emotions through music. Other people think it's obvious that music is emotionally expressive because it elicits emotions in the listener. But in fact, neither of those answers are defensible, I think, because the idea that we express our emotions through music as musicians requires us to be able to do something to put emotions in the music, even when we're not playing the music, for instance, as a composer. And similarly, the mere fact that music arouses emotions in us is not enough to show that music is itself emotional, because, again, we might be made emotional by all sorts of things that are not themselves emotional. We might be made angry by a traffic jam, but that doesn't make the traffic jam angry. That's rather the target of our own anger. So that's perhaps a way of just kind of motivating what the interesting philosophical question is there. I think the other important part, which is maybe more directly an answer to your question, is that if you look at musicology and music theory, who one might think of as the academic study that's centrally devoted to the nature of music, until philosophers really turned their attention to this question of music's emotional expressivity and listeners' emotional responses to music, mainstream Western musicology and music theory was totally formalist for the preceding maybe 100 years at least, perhaps starting with the work of Hanslick in Germany in the middle of the 19th century. That is, all of music theory and musicology was focused on the abstract structures of music and how music is a sort of completely formal abstract art with no content in a way, no human content. Maybe it's got musical content like melodies. But of course, most ordinary people would say, I love music because it's so emotional, either in itself or because it arouses its emotions in me. But the musicologists and music theorists didn't have very much to say about that. So in a way, I think the philosophers of music stepped in to kind of say, like, well, what is this value that people find in music that's somehow connected to emotion? Is it really an objective feature of the music rather than just a subjective reaction? And I think their theories have been aimed at trying to justify emotional expressivity and emotional responses as a legitimate source of artistic value in the music.
Μία ακόμα ερώτηση σχετικά με το κατά πόσο οι μη μαύροι μουσικοί έχουν το ηθικό δικαίωμα να εκτελούν έργα μαύρων, μουσική μαύρων. Το ερώτημα θα μπορούσε να τεθεί γενικότερα, ιδιαίτερα με μεγάλη ποικιλία που παρουσιάζουν σήμερα οι ανταλλαγές μεταξύ μουσικών ιδιωμάτων παγκοσμίως. Θα μπορούσαμε ακόμα, για παράδειγμα, σκέφτομαι τώρα, την κριτική μουσική, η οποία αναμειγνύεται με άλλα είδη και με μη παραδοσιακά όργανα. Σε σχέση με το ερώτημα αυτό που αφορά την κλασική μουσική, με αυτό το ερώτημα που αφορά την κλασική μουσική και την κατηγορία ότι προωθεί παραδοσιακές πατριαρχικές αξίες, θα θέλατε επίσης να μας μεταφέρετε ποια είναι αυτή η άποψη και πώς αιτιολογείται.
Yes, thanks. Those are both really fascinating and I think important topics for philosophers to deal with. And I partly included a chapter which is almost a sort of an orphan in the book on music and morality, because philosophers in the analytic tradition have not really addressed questions about music and morality very much, and yet it seems to me there are interesting questions to be asked there. Philosophers of the arts in the analytic tradition have talked about morality and art a lot, but they tend to focus on more obviously representational art forms like literature and film, the visual arts, where there's a kind of clear human world and often a story which can more obviously be kind of ethically evaluated. So perhaps to take the questions in reverse order, Susan McCleary is a musicologist who made the case over a number of years, she's still active as far as I understand, that music can have all sorts of content, you know, in addition to its abstract structures. So she again was one of the people who was making, I think, quite important philosophical arguments, even though she was in musicology, trying to argue against kind of mainstream musicology and music theory. And her argument was essentially, if you look at the kinds of abstract forms that music theorists discuss, so sonata form being a kind of an obvious one, there's a huge amount of theory on what sonata form is, how it's manifested differently in different works, and so on and so forth, but all treated very abstractly. McCleary, in a way, made a very ingenious and simple addition to the theory by claiming that the individual elements, like musical themes in works in sonata form or any other kind of classical Western tradition, have gendered content. So for instance, in the book I use the example of the first movement of Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which you're probably all familiar with. Apologies for the rendition. Bum 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 bum. You know how it goes. That's the opening theme, and then the second theme, in a different key, it goes more like da da lium bum 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 da da lium bum ba dum. And McCleary pointed out that, hey, that first theme sounds very masculine. It's very kind of bold and forthright. The second theme sounds very feminine. It's gentle and less dramatic. Of course, McCleary is not endorsing these gender norms, but she's pointing out that they're widespread, just as particular forms of dress can be gendered masculine or feminine, particular kinds of behavior. And then she said, now look back at sonata form, which is traditionally told as a story of key relationships, musical keys. It starts off in one key, and then you get a theme in a different key, which kind of disturbs the balance, and then you have a development section where things are kind of worked out, and then a recapitulation where both themes occur in the original key, the tonic key. McCleary points out that if you understand the first theme as masculine and the second theme as feminine, this is essentially a story of masculinity subordinating femininity. It's a man forcing a woman to kind of live according to his terms, in his key. And if that argument is correct, it makes it look like a lot of the most traditionally valued pieces in the Western musical canon are actually stories of the oppression of women. There's been a lot of discussion of this theory, of course, and people have pushed back on it in various ways. And I don't have a strong view about whether to endorse the argument, but I certainly think the argument is worth taking seriously and opens up all sorts of interesting questions about the nature of particularly instrumental music as opposed to music with words, and thus about the nature of the musical medium and what kind of content it can have. So that was a lot on can classical music oppress women. As for the other question, perhaps even more complicated and difficult, can white people play black music, and more general issues about music from one culture being played by people who belong to another culture. There's been a little bit of discussion of this in the philosophical literature, and essentially my own view, such as it is, I think boils down to the notion of respect. If a musical practice is identified in some way with a particular culture, and particularly if that culture is in some way subordinated or oppressed relative to another culture, a kind of dominant majority culture, then it seems to me that members of the dominant majority culture had better be pretty careful about their adoption or appropriation of the musical practices of the subordinated culture. A lot of people have done work on things like sort of economic exploitation in this way, but I think those questions are very important, but I think philosophers have perhaps more to offer in terms of the kind of thinking about those concepts of different cultures and why certain cultural practices can be particularly important to cultures and how those cultural practices can be shared between cultures. So I think it depends a lot on the situation on the ground in terms of the different cultures that you're talking about and what the political or power relations between them are. So I think that sort of question is a very different question from what happens when for instance, Cretan musicians decide to play Cretan music in a traditional style, but incorporate a new instrument or perhaps some kind of electronic use. That seems to me much less problematic. I don't have a view that these cultural practices are somehow kind of pure and unchangeable. It's more a question of who gets to make decisions about what happens in that cultural practice.
Θέλει κάποιος να θέσει ερωτήματα στον Άντριου Κάνια? Αν όχι, Άντριου, εγώ έχω άλλο ένα. Έχεις κουράγιο? Ναι. Με βάση το διαχωρισμό που φαίνεται να υιοθετείς μεταξύ μουσικής γενικά από τη μια πλευρά και μουσικής ως τέχνη, θα με ενδιέφερε, διαβάζοντας το βιβλίο, θα με ενδιέφερε ιδιαίτερα να μας πεις τι κερδίζουμε από τη μουσική, είτε ως ακροατές, είτε ως μουσική, που δεν μπορούμε να έχουμε από κάποια άλλη μορφή τέχνης, αν υπάρχει κάποιο τέτοιο στοιχείο ή αν η αξία της μουσικής εξαντλείται στην αξία της ως τέχνη γενικά και όχι ως μουσική ειδικά.
It's an excellent question, another excellent question, another difficult question. And I think, I mean, one thing that I really struggled with as I wrote the book was that, let me back up a little bit. I'd published a lot on philosophy of music before writing the book, and I taught a lot of philosophy music courses before writing the book, which was very helpful, of course. But this was really my first attempt to kind of step back and try and make sense of everything that philosophers have had to say about music, in the analytic tradition at least, and how it all fit together. And I was more and more convinced of this idea that music should be considered philosophically as a medium rather than necessarily as an art form. But what that meant is you shouldn't be thinking of the value of music just as the value of music as an art. Music might have lots of other values. Maybe it's valuable for manipulating our moods, our emotional states, for instance, independently of any artistic value the music might have. And there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that, right? Maybe music has lots of kind of non-artistic values, just as language can be very useful for everyday communication. That's not an artistic value, but of course, language can also have artistic value when it's used for poetry or other literature. But because most philosophers had approached music through an aesthetic lens, thinking of music as an art, they'd really only written about artistic values of music. So in a sense, I think there's a huge gap waiting to be filled by future philosophers thinking about other values music can have other than as an art. If we think about the values that music has as an art, I think, again, there's this big debate about the extent to which music's value is emotional or is rather formal, and I tend to be a pluralist about those sorts of questions. It seems to me there's a good case to be made for the emotional value of music, but there's also a good case to be made for the formal value of music, and it's not clear to me that we have to choose between them. And different musical pieces, maybe even different musical traditions, will emphasize different values. Western classical music has taken kind of abstract form to an extremely high level, I would say. Whether or not even that music is purely formal. But we shouldn't necessarily assume, therefore, that that's the highest value of music. Other kinds of music have taken the emotional expression to the heights without any particularly interesting formal structures. And so I think music does have both of those values, but different music will have it to different extents. And I also think there's something about the medium of music that is irreplaceable. I don't think Nietzsche once wrote in a letter that life without music would be a mistake. I think that's a little bit strong. I think you could have a perfectly good life without music. Because you would have other things to enjoy, other arts and other forms of expression and all sorts of other things. But I think there would be something valuable lost if we lost music. So I think music does have its own particular irreplaceable value. And I think that value must be in something like those basic musical features I was talking about earlier, pitches and rhythms and the way that they're combined into the medium of music. Because lots of other arts express emotions or elicit our emotions. Lots of other arts make use of abstract forms. It seems that what's unique to music, if anything, is the particular medium of music. It's pitches and rhythms, in much the way that what's unique to the art form of literature is the fact that it uses words. So again, I think it all comes back to kind of the nature of the medium itself.
Είναι μια μικρή ερώτηση ακόμα. Έχουμε το χρόνο να την κάνω και να μας απαντήσει ο Άντριου ή να του την κάνω ιδιαιτέρως μετά. Λοιπόν, επομένως, ποια είναι εκείνα τα στοιχεία που ορίζουν τη μουσική ως μορφή τέχνης? Αν θεωρείτε ότι ποιες θεωρείς μάλλον εσύ, ποιες θεωρείς ότι είναι αναγκαίες και επαρκείς συνθήκες που πρέπει να ικανοποιούνται ώστε να δεχτούμε ότι ένα έργο ανήκει στο πεδίο της τέχνης της μουσικής. Αν πιστεύεις ότι υπάρχουν τέτοιες συνθήκες. Και κλείνουμε με αυτό.
It's another difficult question. In a way, I feel like, as I said earlier, that this question, I mean, perhaps it has two parts. One part of it is what is it that makes something music? And that I would answer with the appeal to the medium of music that I described earlier, features like pitch and meter. Then the other question is, what makes something art? And there I feel like I used to have views about this, and I've just become more and more confused. I often find myself thinking that perhaps some traditional aesthetic notion of art is the most defensible at the end of the day. That requires coming up with some sort of theory of the aesthetic, which I'm in no position to do. But I think if that's correct, the view we would be inclined towards is something like a view of art as being on a continuum. So for instance, we are very aesthetic creatures. If you look around this room, even what you might think of as the most functional items, the tables, the chairs, even the disposable cups, right? People have taken care with their appearances to make them look nicer than they would have looked if they were purely functional. And I think once you start thinking about that and start thinking about different kinds of artifacts we make that are kind of more or less aesthetic, it's difficult to start to draw clear lines between the art and the non-art, if that is the mark of, if the aesthetic is the mark of art. So for instance, I talked earlier about the doorbell. Ding dong. I think nobody would call that a work of music, a work of art. And yet, someone's taken care to choose those particular pictures because they're aesthetically pleasing. You would rather have that be your doorbell than something that went, right? There's a reason that's the kind of, fire alarm sound and not the doorbell sound, because it's supposed to kind of shock you and make you think something's wrong. And so, in a sense, I feel like this answer is a sort of a non-answer. Perhaps there are no necessary and sufficient conditions that will make some musical sounds and silences art. It's more a matter of a kind of a spectrum with respect to which the most aesthetically interesting ones are the most artistic. But even as I say that, the objections come to mind. It seems to me that there can be undeniably terrible artworks, that is, artworks that are really bad as art. And I don't want to say that they are not artworks as a result. But that seems to conflict with this notion that that artisticness goes along with aestheticness. And so maybe a more what's sometimes called an institutional approach is better, which would be something like, if you take yourself to be contributing towards an established practice, that it is an artistic practice, then what you're doing is art. And if you take yourself not to be doing that, if you take yourself to be just designing chairs or tables or coffee cups, then what you're doing doesn't count as art, because we don't consider those practices artistic practices. But if that's the case, then it seems to me that art should not be thought of as so honorific a term as we typically do. We typically think of art as being in some sense a value-laden term. But if art is just a matter of contributing to a certain kind of a practice, and artworks can be good or bad, as we all, I think, tend to agree, then maybe we shouldn't be thinking of art as necessarily a kind of positively valuable thing.
Ευχαριστούμε πολύ τον Άντριου Κάνια και ευχαριστούμε θερμά το Φεστιβάλ Βιβλίου Χανίων, τον Διευθυντή Μανώλη Πιμπλή και βεβαίως τους εξαιρετικούς συνεργάτες τους. Ευχαριστούμε και περιμένουμε με ανυπομονησία και τα επόμενα, τα οποία θα είναι πολλά βέβαια ακόμα, ελπίζουμε. Καλό σας βράδυ, ευχαριστούμε που ήρθατε.